Taiwan's strategy in these terms is actually, it does make sense.
Welcome to Taiwan Talk. I'm your host, Tim Berge. As has been reported in the New York Times, Taiwan spent the better part of the past 3 years making the case for how the fate of democracies is closely tied with what happens to Ukraine, and which also has implications for Taiwan. Most recently, the prospect of the White House trying to make a deal with Russia over Ukraine without actually giving Ukraine a seat at the table could result in growing skepticism in Taiwan. With these questions in mind, we recently had a talk with Jakub Janda, the director of the European Value Center of Security Policy, a non-partisan NGO based in the Czech Republic, with a mission to defend freedom and national sovereignty. Janda has spent the last few months in Taiwan studying these issues firsthand. We started out our conversation discussing comments he made back in December in the lead up to the inauguration of President Trump.
So the main concerns for many Europeans, including myself, has been how hard will President Trump's administration pressure European allies, because the pressure on defense spending and more European support for Ukraine is very obvious and right and just. But if it's overdone, and if it's more of, let's say, United States pressuring Ukraine to surrender, then it becomes a strategic problem. And that's what I'm afraid where we are in now, where we are basically seeing a U.S. pressure to Ukraine to pretty much capitulate to various demands. And it's very damaging for U.S.-led alliance in Europe. And from my understanding here in Taiwan, it's being seen as a very negative trend, which is worrying a lot of people and questioning the U.S. alliance from point of view of Taiwan or, for example, Japan or Korea.
After Ukrainian President Zelensky's contentious meeting at the White House last month, Janda fears the pressure for peace is only being exerted on one side.
This seems to be an effort by the U.S. president to pressure first Ukraine to accept, various deals with United States would have for Ukraine, but also to pressure Europeans, other EU nations, to actually be, more accepting of what the United States want. And that's defense spending, where it makes good sense. That's more European support for Ukraine instead of the US-led support for Ukraine. So those things do make sense. But the problem is that at the same time, we do not see the US president pressuring Russia. And that's something what worries many people in European capitals, that if the pressure was only on the allies, to do the right things, then it's kind of understandable and it's a clear path forward. But now we do not see kind of a longer thing pretty much helps to force Russia to any ceasefire. Because now Russia sees this as emboldening, as something what supports Russian strategic objectives against Ukraine and against Europe. So that is the worrying part.
Meanwhile, when it comes to Taiwan, Janda sees signs which point to a policy which could be beneficial. But at the same time, Taiwan needs to do more to beef up its national defense.
From what we have seen from the President Trump's administration, there has been multiple actions by the U.S. government, which are actually, let's say, building up the coalition against China. So on that side, it doesn't seem to be as damaging as the U.S. actions towards Europe are for now. Obviously, there are indirect U.S. foreign assistance programs through USAID or now the National Endowment for Democracy. Those things are hurting the U.S. coalition badly, because most organizations which have been exposing, for example, Chinese hostile behavior in much of Asia are pretty much now being killed because of the U.S. funding streams are being killed at this moment. So this is very negative. But I think the main lesson for countries like Taiwan is that first you need to yourself be as resilient, as strong as possible. And that's why, very practically, Taiwan needs to at least double its defense spending. And honestly, not because the United States are asking for it, but just for its own survival. Because if you are in a situation of Taiwan, having 2.5 or 3% GDP defense spending, that's very, very low. And that means that your military capabilities will not be helping you, or will not really help you survive for long if the enemy attacks. If you just look at the Cold War era, how roughly speaking the defense spending looked like, 2.5 or 3% is very low. And that's what I think the main thing which Taiwan needs to do. And the current government of Taiwan is pushing for it heavily now. I think Taiwan's strategy in these terms is actually, I mean, it does make sense. It's pretty much now, Taiwan is pretty much paying back to the United States for the support with all these TSMC investment announcements. So those things actually do make sense to make sure that the US-led coalition or actions towards Taiwan will be stable. So I think this is what Taiwan is definitely doing right. Many European governments are not doing this, and that's one of the reasons why the alliance relationship is so bad between Europe and the United States. But Taiwan is pretty much in a safe place in this regard. But the main question is how much will Taiwan be, let's say, actionable, because there is a clear political divide in the legislative yuan, in the parliament, where pretty much the opposition is blocking many of the defense efforts or defense boosting efforts of the Taiwanese government. And this is pretty much paralyzing, not only in domestic terms inside Taiwan, but also for Taiwan's international standing. So this is the domestic homework for Taiwan, obviously the main political domestic fight here. And nobody can really help from the outside. That's for the Taiwanese people to really decide.
At the same time, Janda feels there are other factors which are working in Taiwan's favor.
I think United States have basically no option not to get involved if Taiwan gets attacked for two simple reasons. First, because if Taiwan would be lost to China, in the eyes of the United States, much of the U.S. economy would be collapsing because of the dependency on Taiwanese semiconductors, and specifically the most advanced ones, which are being produced in Taiwan and will not be produced in the United States. So that's the reason number one. But the second reason is more regional or strategic, which is that pretty much the United States are trying to build a coalition against China and North Korea as well in the whole region, in Indo-Pacific. And if Taiwan would fall to the Chinese hands during a fight or a blockade, that would likely mean that the coalition would collapse, because many countries in the region would basically say, look, the United States were unable of defending Taiwan, so it doesn't make sense for us to stand up against China, and we better basically give up and become Chinese economic colonies. And the United States would pretty much lose everybody in the Indo-Pacific, maybe with the exception of Japan and Australia, who are in a very difficult position and they have no other geopolitical choice. But everybody else, including Korea or the ASEAN countries, including the Philippines and Vietnam, would most likely basically turn into the Chinese orbit, because they would see no reason to actually keep resisting China if China gets Taiwan. So for those two reasons, I really would expect that the United States cannot give up on Taiwan, because it would be like a full-scale capitulation of U.S. interests and also domestic interests in the United States when it comes to economic stability, because of the reliance on Taiwanese imports from Taiwan.
Moving forward, stronger economic, political, and even military relations with Europe will be in Taiwan's best interest.
I think it clearly makes sense for Taiwan to keep engaging and deepening its relationships with specific European countries. It sometimes really much helps on strategic messaging or sharing lessons learned from, for example, from Ukraine. That's something what helps Taiwan. Taiwan needs more international support and cooperation from European nations, and that is slowly happening now. But very practically, if China will try to isolate and blockade Taiwan, for example, actually, Europe is very important for two reasons. First, many of European companies in Taiwan are actually very critical to domestic stability in Taiwan. For example, in telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, or shipping industry. And second, because actually European actions during such a crisis would not be like primarily decisive. That would be about the United States and Japan. But secondarily, European sanctions on China would actually play a role in decision-making of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's something why it is important for Taiwan to keep doing it. And at this time, it's clear that the U.S. confrontation with China will be about Taiwan. I mean, it will likely be about Japan and Philippines as well, but Taiwan is the obvious hotspot, where it's not going to get easier. So for that reason, I think the engagement with specific Europeans makes sense. That's why you see the TSMC investment in Germany as well, as the heart, or kind of political and geopolitical heart of Europe. So that's why Taiwan is trying to get these Europeans on board. So from European point of view, there are specific nations, including my own Czech Republic, which see Taiwan as a kind of good opportunity also for business and trade relations. So, for example, now Czech Republic is getting more and more of Taiwanese investment in terms of ICT or also the semiconductor supply chain companies. So this is very positive for example, Czech domestic economy. So business-wise makes sense, but also geopolitically speaking, much of European security is dependent on the United States and will stay dependent pretty much regardless of what President Trump does, which means that for some Europeans it's important to be good allies and also doing kind of joining the geopolitical coalition led by the United States. And in these times, it is clearly going to be about how U.S.-led coalition defends Taiwan, influence-wise, geopolitically, and maybe militarily as well. So, for example, there are now talks between specific European nations and Taiwan about drone cooperation, about UAVs. So that's where I see a lot of opportunity in the future.
That was Jakub Janda, the director of the European Values Center of Security Policy, a non-partisan NGO based in the Czech Republic with a mission to defend freedom and national sovereignty. Don't forget to enjoy this, past, and future episodes of Taiwan Talk online. Just look for us on your favorite podcast platform. For Taiwan Talk, I'm Tim Berge.